Over the last few years, jerkbaits have really taken off. They've gone from a strictly wintertime presentation to being used all year long, and with great success. But I see anglers using jerkbaits in some of the worst way possible. Today, we're going to look at my system for using jerkbaits and how it can help you catch tons more fish. Stick around, you don't want to miss this one.
That's got to be grass. Oh, that's a fish. That is a fish. That's a good fish. That's a good fish. That's an amazing fish. Ooh, I thought, wow, he's putting up a heck of a fight. This one's a good sized fish here, kids. Where do you want to go? Where do you want to go? Oh, that's a big fish. That is a huge fish. Where are you going, buddy? He's pulling my little boat all kind of which ways.
Welcome back to Lowbrow Fishing, and today we're talking all about jerkbaits. And even though we're moving from the winter months into the spring, jerkbaits are still some of the most reliable presentations we as anglers have available to us. And today we're going to be looking at the system I use for not just picking the jerkbaits, but how I fish them and what gear I like to use. But before we get started, if you like bass fishing content that tries to be inclusive, whether you're fishing from a boat or whether you're fishing from the bank, and always with a focus on budget, because not everybody's got a lot of money to spend on bass fishing gear, well then click that subscribe button. This is the channel for you. And when you're down there, give this video a like. I would really appreciate it. Now first up is, well, this guy right here, right? The old Rapala floating minnow. For a lot of us older anglers, this is what comes to mind when we think of old school jerkbait fishing. This is the one that started it all for most of us who think about jerkbait fishing. As the story goes, back in the day, in the Ozark region of the country, these were used in places like Lake of the Ozarks and Bull Shoals and those types of areas where anglers figured out you didn't have to straight retrieve these, which is actually what they're designed for. They're almost like a wake bait, except they go a little bit lower. You can crank them in or you control them, and that's where these were first designed to be used. But anglers figured out you could twitch them and then give them a pause and then twitch them and then give them a pause, and they would float back up. And then you twitch them back down and work the bait like that. And bass would come up from very deep water to just obliterate them. And jerkbait fishing, as we know it, was born. And now, well, we've seen like we've got jerkbaits for every single occasion. We've got shallow water, we've got small ones, we've got some that are made specifically for forward-facing sonar, and we have some really impressive deep diving jerkbaits. Now, when I'm picking a jerkbait, it starts with two things. How are those bass feeding, and where are they at in the water column? During the spring, I like to go with topwater. We've talked about that to begin with, right? From when I get out on the water, I tie on a spook, I tie on a buzzbait, and I begin to cover water. But sometimes, if we've had a cold front come through, if we've had some bad weather come through that have pushed those bass maybe just a little bit deeper, they're still going to be in the same area, but they may not be as willing to bust on a topwater bait. So that's when I'm going to be switching to something like a jerkbait, where I can work just below that surface to see if I can call the bass up out of that hydrilla and strike the lure. So if I'm fishing relatively shallow water and I know those bass are going to be a little bit active, then something like this, another old school favorite, the old Rapala minnow, a floating minnow such as this, or even a CC shad, a cotton cordell shad. These things can be great. I love the fact that it looks like a little minnow, it looks like a little bait fish, and I can work it essentially like you would an old school Rapala floating minnow, where you give it a few twitches and then you let it float back up, and then you give it a few more twitches and you let it float back up. And it can be such an amazing fish catching tool. I can't tell you, especially this year when I've rediscovered using it, how many fish that I was able to catch. Now, if I want to go just a little bit bigger, well, then there's this, right? The good old Smithwick Rattling Rogue. And this is also a hard float. And I don't know how well it can show up on camera, but you see how beat up and eat up this thing is. I've had this thing for years, and the bass have absolutely destroyed this. Now this, I actually like to work a bit faster. I don't give it a lot of pauses, but I don't necessarily crank it down because I'm still working it in a lot of those shallow areas. So I basically jerk it down, and then I will try to keep it at depth. I may give it a few pauses, but for the most part, I'm working this pretty quickly. You know, you guys have seen me do that during the summertime, during the warmer weather months. I'm working this really, really quickly, trying to keep it down and that little bit bigger size. And I don't know what it is about this color. I don't know what it is about this ugly, ugly brown, copper, whatever you want to call that color. It just gets bit. It's unlike anything that the bass are seeing in the lake. It's unlike any other lure that's being thrown, but it gets bites. Now we're going to get into what a lot of people consider the modern style of jerkbait. We've dealt with the Rapala minnows, we've dealt with the Rebel minnows, and the Rattling Rogues. But now we have something in that modern style, and that's this KVD 200. It's got a little bit smaller bill. These don't get down nearly as far as some of the other ones that we'll talk about, but I like these because this is a suspending jerkbait. So I had the option of working it fast or working it more slowly. And a lot of times those bass will be in just a little bit deeper water. I'm using this in about that 8-foot range, maybe 7 foot, but I do like it in about that 7 foot, 8 foot, 10 foot, 15 foot range of water depth. This will work magnificently. And just because it's 15 feet of water, that doesn't mean this won't call those bass up, because it absolutely will. So I'm working this a little bit more slowly. Usually this is where I will give it some really hard jerks, really work it very frenetically, and then I'm going to let it pause. I have this one, I've got the chrome one, I've got several designs of this KVD 200, and just a regular 2-hooked 200 size jerkbait. It doesn't have to be a KVD. This is just one that I like. Maybe you have a brand that you like. Maybe a Shadow Wrap is something that you lean towards, you know, a smaller size like that. This works great for me. Use what works for you. The point is to pick the right jerkbait for those conditions. If I have some cloudy skies, I've got some stain in the water, and I've got some chop, I'm going to be using that chrome colored KVD. If I've got maybe some calmer days, or maybe I've got some clearer water or some sunnier skies, then I'm going to be going to this more natural pattern. And the whole reason I'm doing that is so those bass can actually see that bait, not just hear it. Because when they get close enough, the sound draws them up. The sound and the action under the water draws those bass up. They've got to be able to see it to have something to key in on and strike it. Now we're going to get to a quote normal style of jerkbait. When most people think of a jerkbait nowadays, they're thinking of something like this. And this is a Sixth Sense Provoke. It's your standard 300 size jerkbait. It's got all 3 hooks. It's got a little bit bigger bill. This will get down in a little bit deeper water. This is 5/8 ounce, so it's a little bit heavier. It's got that weight system, that weight transfer system in there, so it can cast like a missile. And this thing does. I can bomb this thing out there. And I'm using lighter gear. We're going to talk about the gear setup that I like to use, but when I'm using that lighter tackle, I can really sail this out there. I can make 200 feet casts on this easily, especially with the wind at my back. And again, I'm going to be fishing this in probably about that 10, 15 feet of water. This will get me down a little bit deeper, but it will also suspend. These suspend, so I can actually work them faster. I can work them a little bit slower, but if those bass are actually feeding on something a little bit bigger, this will give me the perfect size. It's still not huge, but it's an upsize, and this will actually draw some bigger strikes, you know. Also, something like my good old Yozuris. You guys, if you've been watching the channel, you know I love these Yozuri jerkbaits. Now, this has got a bigger bill even still, so this gets down a little bit deeper. This gets down to about 5 to 7 feet, and you can really feel it when you're working it. This has got a good bit of tug to it, but on a cloudier day, on a day with some stain, that white, that translucent white, just actually shimmers in the water, and I can use it to get a lot of great strikes. And I've caught tons of fish on that Yo-Zuri jerkbait. Now, lastly, we're going to talk about some options for a deep diving jerkbait. And for me, there's really two different variations. Again, if those bass are kind of lethargic, if they're deep and they're feeding on smaller fish, then I'm using something like this Storm Thunderstick. And I know this isn't really a true jerkbait. This is a trolling bait for walleye. But, tell that to the bass, right? You see how eat up this thing is. I use it in a lot of the same ways that I'm using something like the Rattlin' Rogue. This, I will wind down the depth. And this dude gets down to about 15 feet with that great big plastic bill, which is, it's starting to get eat up a little bit because I'll actually grind this in the ground a little bit, but not by cranking it. I actually twitch it and it goes into the ground and moves like that along the bottom when I'm working this bait. With this, I can use this as a smaller presentation. I can get into some deeper water and I can still work those bass where they are at. Again, like I said, I'm using the jerkbait that I need based on how those bass are feeding. They're looking for little fish, then I've got something small, and where they're at in the water column. If they're deeper in the water column and they don't really feel like coming up, then I can go down there to them with something like this. The only thing that I need after that is to pick the color of it, and I do that based on the conditions. This is obviously great on those days when I need some flash. Obviously, if I've got some cloud cover, I've got more wind, I've got some stain in the water, that subtle flash under the surface will really draw that bass's attention. Now, lastly, I have your standard deep diving style of jerkbait, and that's this guy right here. This is a Smithwick Perfect 10. This is a big jerkbait. Let me, if we've got to compare it to something, this is that 6 cents provoke. You can see just how much bigger this jerkbait is. This thing is a monster. And this thing gets down to about 10 to 12 feet, and it's a suspending jerkbait. So I can get it down there, and I can leave it down there. And I like kind of that darker, translucent color, because a lot of times I can get down in that deeper, murkier water, and this has actually got a really good profile. It actually stands out in that deeper water, and I've caught some really great fish on this. Now, this one right here, I'm actually fishing this on a heavier duty bait cast reel. I'll have 17-pound test line on it, probably a 7 to 7.3 medium heavy rod, and I'll cast this out there. I'll crank it down, and then I will work it. I give it some jerks, and then I will leave it. I'm not working this one so fast because at those depths, I really don't feel like I need to, because a lot of times those bass are already in that area. And that's what this is for, to go down to those bass. And like I said, I've caught some really great fish on it. If those bass are in a mood for a bigger meal and you want to get it down in front of their face and then just leave it there for them to have to stare at, that's a great way of doing it. Now, I said I was going to tell you what type of gear I'm using. When I talked about this guy, I told you I fish it on a bait caster. But for all of these other jerkbaits that I'm using, I fish them on a spinning combo. Now, something like this, I'm going to be using 8 to 10 pound braid, and I'll probably be throwing this on a 7-foot medium light rod, where these I'm going to be throwing on a medium rod. Now, I know a lot of guys like using a jerkbait on a bait caster, and there's nothing wrong with that. Use what you feel most comfortable using. Myself, I use it on a spinning combo. I have a few pro angler buddies who use spinning rods predominantly when they're fishing jerkbaits. They asked me, they said, "Lil bro, give that a try. Try fishing that on a spinning combo." And I'm telling you what, once I started doing it, I started catching more fish doing it, and I never looked back. So I'm using these smaller ones on a medium light spinning combo, 8 to 10 pound line, usually braid, because braid will cast a mile on a spinning reel. And with something like these guys here, a little bit bigger, a little bit heavier, I'll throw these on a 7-foot medium rod, still using a spinner, and roughly around 10-pound braid, because again, with that braided line on a spinning combo, I can throw it a mile. So give these a try. Work the bait based on the situation. Don't just arbitrarily pick a jerkbait because that's the jerkbait you like. Think about how you need that bait to work, where you need it to work. And when you do that, you're going to get way more bites. So there you have it. My system for fishing jerkbaits from the spring all the way around into the fall. This system has always worked so well for me. Give it a try. I really think you're going to like it. Thanks for watching Lowbrow Fishing. We'll catch you in the next one.